my distinct pleasure to introduce now the Reverend Dr. Vincent McMillan, who is a senior pastor at St. Paul Baptist Church, who will introduce our president, with whom he has a very special relationship. Dr. McMillan.
Thank you, Dr. Yaden. When my wife asked me to do this, I had to remind her that I was a preacher and a pastor, so I'll be as brief as I can. With respect to the LRA Board of Directors, its past presidents, to this august LRA membership, and to my family and our friends, it is my privilege and honor to introduce to some and to present to others one who needs no introduction but is worthy of an introduction. To some, she is a loyal and trusted colleague. To others, a devoted, caring mother. She is also a cherished sister and a dear friend to those who know her best. She is my beloved bride, my wife, my partner in ministry, and my best friend and confidant, Dr. Gwendolyn Thompson McMillan. Let me start by telling you some things about her you may not know, and how I view the relevance of her work and research. We've been married now for 35 short years, a journey that I wouldn't trade for anything. Early in her graduate studies, Gwen came home and said to me, "I believe I'm called to teach." That got my undivided attention. Now, if you know Gwen, you know that she is a woman of faith. So when she said to me, "I believe that I've been called to teach," as a man of faith, I understood that one's calling is not necessarily by choice, that when you are called to do something, you are driven by that which is bigger than yourself. I was reminded of the words of the Apostle Paul, an ancient tent maker from the city of Tarsus, who said, "Be worthy of the vocation in which you are called." Gwen, being a pastor's daughter, had no doubt heard these very words in her young life, and now in her adult life, having accepted that high call, set out to make herself worthy of the call. The English definition of that word, worthy, means having or showing the qualities or abilities that merit recognition in a specified way, a notable or important person in a particular sphere. That's a good definition. However, the recognition of qualities or abilities are slightly tilted toward the person and not toward the one who called the person to the work. The English definition lacks the full and balanced intent that Paul was getting at. To recognize the one who called Dr. McMillan to this timely research and work is where we find sustaining balance, which begs larger questions for any research, motive, or agenda. What is the purpose of one's research? What lasting contribution to humanity will one's work ultimately amount to? In 1859, when Horace Mann, as president of the Antioch College, gave his own valedictory to the graduating class, he said, "I beseech you to treasure up in your heart these my parting words. Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity. One of the primary reasons Dr. McMillan's calling and work should be recognized and celebrated is because, on its own merit, it has the historic and authoritative influence to have significant and sustaining societal impact. As a nation, we are in desperate need of the kind of work and research that Dr. McMillan has her hands, her head, and her heart tied to. To show you the importance of this work, her calling, and her motive behind her research, let me illustrate. Pulitzer Prize winner Isabel Wilkerson, in her most recent work entitled Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, argues that our nation's discontents has as much, if not more, to do with the ancient systems of caste than of the worldwide construct of race. To describe the history of our nation, Wilkerson uses the metaphor of an old house whose many, many renovations over time best describe our national history and legacy, in which we all now live and work. A history that's been hidden by layers, metaphorically, layers of paint. A history whose cracked walls, divided closets, and shifting foundations have been plastered over, therefore a history that's been meticulously covered up and forgotten by most. Wilkerson uses this metaphor to illustrate our skewed and incomplete American story and heritage. John Dewey, regardless of his personal beliefs, I'm convinced was right when he said, and I quote, "Democracy has to be born anew in every generation, and education is its midwife," unquote. If this democracy, if this old house is to stand, then education as we know it has to be reimagined and retold, including all of its cast members, all of its cracks, flaws, and triumphs. Dr. McMillan's work and research takes a deep dive into our story, the story of this old house. Her work has the potential to dismantle systems of inequality and inequity across the educational sphere of learning by reimagining and retelling our collective story through the lens of the Black church, whose historic focus has always been one of universal care and unity. When Dr. King spoke of the universal church during the so-called civil rights movement, a portion of the church and society was and still is silent on issues of inequity and inequality. Dr. King said, and I quote, "The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, but never its tool. If the churches do not capture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority," unquote. This happens when politics informs our faith rather than our faith informing our politics. I would go even a step further and ask, in our hallowed halls of higher education, have we too become as social clubs by abandoning our moral obligation? We do if and when we allow the authentic voice of history to be silenced for convenience sake. It really does have to do with one's motive for research. Dr. McMillan's life work is born out of a prophetic call rooted in the church. Her life and work has been nurtured and cradled in the fidelity of the Black church by the historic witnesses of its sojourners and other well-meaning partners of the faith. And if we can connect the dots of our common yet still unclaimed history to this nation whose promises has been for all of its citizens to strive for a more perfect union, if we can connect the dots, we will someday emerge as a more perfect people. Dr. McMillan's life and work, research, as an example, helps us all to connect those dots. In preparation for this calling, Dr. McMillan graduated from the University of Michigan with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics, which bode her and this organization well when she served 6 years as its treasurer. She began her graduate work at Saginaw Valley State University College of Education, where she earned a Master of Education degree in educational leadership. Not long after, she finished her doctoral work at Michigan State University College of Education in East Lansing, Michigan, earning a PhD in curriculum, teacher education, and social policy. Dr. McMillan is a Spencer Fellow. In 2011, she was an honored recipient of the Edward B. Fry Book Award for a 2010 published work co-authored entitled "A Change is Gonna Come: Transforming Literacy Education for African American Students." Additionally, just released by Teachers College Press is another co-authored work entitled "Affirming Black Students' Lives and Literacy, Bearing Witness." Dr. McMillan has been awarded a number of grants to carry out this purposeful work and research in the community in which she grew up as a child. She is the vice president of the Wolverine State Missionary Baptist Convention, the Women's Auxiliary, and project director of the Wolverine State I Read, I Lead, and I Succeed project, a statewide reading initiative. And she is a member of the Michigan Pre-K-12 Literacy Governors Commission. Dr. McMillan is a professor of literacy in the Department of Reading and Language Arts, School of Education and Human Resources at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, please stand on your feet. Please stand on your feet and help me to welcome our president to this podium for her 2021 Literacy Research Association presidential address. Let's welcome her, Dr. McMillan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Feel like I need to say, and let the church say, amen. Thank you so much, Vincent. To our conference chair, congratulations, David, and congratulations, Doris, on getting us back together. Doesn't it feel wonderful? Yes. Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I reverence God, my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the author and finisher of my faith. Through Christ, I can do all things because he gives me strength, and without him, I can do nothing but fail. He has poured out his favor and blessings upon us over and over again, and I bless his name for his faithfulness. All that I am and ever hope to be, I owe it all to thee. To God be the glory. Secondly, I want to recognize my family who is in the house today. My husband, you just met, Reverend Dr. Vincent McMillan. My sons, Morgan, Dr. David, and Joshua are here. My siblings, Bessie, wave your hand real fast, I'm going fast. Bessie, Phyllis, MT and Ivory, Billy and Tracy, and Randy, all are here. My Aunt Faye, my nieces and nephews, cousins, sister friends. Wave. Yes. I'm blessed to have my doctoral students here. Young is up there. He's working all of this for me. Mary is here and Emily, my OU colleagues. I love you guys. Thank you so much for being here with me. Last but not least, my LRA family, including the board of directors, committees, ICGs, area chairs, e-editors, star fellows. It has been a labor of love. We are family. I need to send a special shout out to my advisory team, Pat Edwards, Arlette Willis, Janice L. Macy, who just won the award, and Gay Ivy. Thank you for listening, responding, and praying for me. And to my prayer warriors, Patrianne, Cindy, and Tisha, thank you. Finally, thanks to our ASG management team. You've made a difference in my life. I really appreciate you. I have chosen to include a stewardship report in my presidential talk today. Because we've experienced some critical moments over the past few years, please allow me to update you on the health of LRA. As you know, 2020 was a year of uncertainty, but when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. I'm happy to inform you, in 2020, when other organizations were falling apart, LRA netted more than $100,000 on our virtual conference. Hats off to the exceptional team. I know, for real, right? Hats off to the exceptional teamwork of our board, ASG, and Marla, for our treasurer, for keeping those numbers tight. We began 2021 by establishing 3 goals: to unify the organization and become a community of scholars, to increase LRA's visibility, and to bring LRA into compliance. First, to unify the organization and move toward becoming a community of scholars, we work toward more transparency in operations in several ways. Training was offered to all LRA leaders to help them better understand the administrative side of LRA. Board support persons were provided for our standing committees to keep the lines of communication flowing. The board voted to allocate $200,000 to financially support mentoring, research, and leadership efforts. Multiple opportunities were offered throughout the year, such as ERM Mentoring Initiative, that will result in a journal publication for each participant. Phil Console added HBCU and HSI representatives to ensure that LRA is actively engaging in recruiting BIPOC scholars. And the Gender and Sexualities Mentoring Initiative is underway to support our colleagues who conduct research in the area and/or identify as LGBTQ+. To increase LRA's visibility, 2 research reports were distributed through national press releases. Several webinars were sponsored during the year, including those led by History ICG, the Doctoral Student ICG, and the Research Committee, as well as the co-sponsored webinar with the University of Florida led by Dr. Patrianne Smith, based on the Rachel Justice Literacy Research reports. And we also gave approval to the Reading Recovery Journal to republish our dyslexia literacy report. And we're currently in the midst of working with the National Academy of Education colleagues in a cross-organizational effort led by Carol Lee. On Thursday and Friday at 3, make sure you attend that session. This year, the board approved the most diverse group of editors in the history of the journal for the Journal of Literacy Research. If you are here, will you stand, please? Our incoming editors. Anybody here? Okay, all right. I'd like to thank Kristen and our publications team. Also, last week we finalized our SAGE contract, and as a part of our agreement, SAGE will provide diversity, equity, and inclusion training. This means, beginning in January 2022, all reviewers of LRA Journal manuscripts and conference proposals will be DEI trained, and that's awesome. The journal will go fully online beginning in January of 2022, but don't worry, those of you who love the smell of pages can still purchase one for $20. Finally, the board approved a $25,000 overhaul of our LRA website. Regular blogging, opportunities for scholarly critical conversations, and up-to-date social media visibility will help to establish a digital footprint of excellence that is sure to increase our visibility. Thanks to Ian, Amy, VJ, Caitlin, and Adrian from InterWorks Pro for working with me on this. Finally, our last goal. To bring LRA into compliance has taken several years, and many presidents have worked on this. But we finally finished the work and established procedures that will keep us in compliance. All LRA leaders, including committee members, are media compliance trained. Additionally, the PPH is up to date, thanks to Rachel, Cassie, and VJ. People who have been on the board understand that, including a whistleblower policy. So I'm happy to let you know also, everyone, we finally have the photo archive from past President Lee Gunderson, as well as a policy that protects the people in Lee's beautiful photos that he's taken over a period of time, thanks to Sam, our historian. I have two recommendations for the future. Now that we have more than $500,000 in our emergency fund, we need to continue to build our financial infrastructure. Increased donations, especially from estate planning, and the establishment of endowments are necessary for long-term sustainability. And our conference chair and president-elect has graciously allowed me to have that as my past president project. So we will continue working on making sure that LRA is financially healthy. Now, to begin the research portion of my presidential talk, let us pay homage to all of the researchers, teachers, advocates, activists, and ancestors on whose shoulders we stand. Their ideas and work laid a firm foundation upon which we must build. I can't call all of the names of the people who focused on educating African American children, but it is my duty to name the insiders whose ideas have impacted my thinking the most. Many of them have passed away, but we honor them. John Akbu, Catherine Dorsey Gaines, and of course my advisor and mentor, Pat Edwards. Marion Wright Edelman, Dr. Arlette Willis. You are familiar with many of the ideas and stories of the inside influencers of literacy education for Black children. Many of you read their research and cite them. You may have even put in the work to be allies and co-conspirators. Perhaps you truly know yourself and have developed ways to address your own idiosyncrasies, privileges, and biases. If you have, that's great. There's still room for improvement. If not, I encourage you to do so. It's imperative that we wrestle with our own issues before focusing on the issues of others. As we continue the roll call, you will see some familiar faces, and some of them you may not be as familiar with. But these are the heroes and sheroes of African American children's education. We cannot value the liberation of others until we truly learn to liberate ourselves and experience liberation on a personal level. It is in this spirit of liberation that I come to you today to talk about an institution that has no peers, the Black church, the mother wound of the Black community and the conscience of our nation. The history of the Black experience in school settings has been one of turmoil, frustration, and humiliation. The previous roll call of scholars who tirelessly advocated specifically for Black students and their right to literacy spanned over 200 years, and many of them are still fighting the good fight. But I stand here today to let you know that the negative experiences within the educational system of the United States are in stark contrast to the positive learning experiences that the Black church has provided. A question for the 21st century is, what can educators, particularly literacy researchers, learn from the Black church? The Black church has a proven track record of teaching and reaching Black families and children, yet the voice of the Black church has been ignored in the conversation concerning the best way to educate Black students in America's schools. While comparing the histories of church and school, it becomes apparent why many Black students have historically had difficulties excelling in their school environments, but have been and continue to be successful in the learning environment of the Black church. I want to be clear that my goal is not to defend that statement. The Black church needs no defense. Instead, as an insider, I invite you to look through a window of opportunity that will make a world unknown to many transparent. I encourage you to leave your preconceived notions, biases, prejudices, and the miseducation that many of us received in our shallow history classes behind during this conversation. Allow yourselves to experience the cognitive dissonance that you may feel and sincerely consider unlearning, unpacking, and even discarding some of the baggage that you've carried for far too long about the Black experience. I challenge you on today to stay with me and walk alongside me as we travel through space and time. By simultaneously discussing the historical development of the Black church and the literacy, acquisition, and development of African American people affiliated with the Black church, it will become apparent that the two portray a direct relationship. As the Black church grows, Black people become more literate. And as Black people become more literate, the Black church grows. I will show how this growth was based on a foundation of Black liberation theology, which developed from the initial need for a unified response to the slave master's effort to justify slavery with the Christian Bible, and a continuous need to fight racism in the United States. With more than 300 years of experience, the Black church is the proven expert in teaching and reaching Black students. What is the Black church? In order to fully grasp the nature of my argument, it is necessary first to understand what the Black church is to Black people. The separation of church and state does not exist for many Blacks because they believe that religion plays a significant role in every aspect of their lives. Broadly conceived, the Black church is often represented as the most successful and influential institution in the Black community. As such, many metaphors have been used to describe the Black church. Historically, it has taken the leadership role in the Black community by serving as the mouthpiece, advocate, and defender. The Black church has always been the clearinghouse for the community. Whether the issues were social, political, economic, or educational, the Black church has been the place where conversations occurred, ideas were shared, problems were solved, and actions were taken. To Blacks, the church is not just a place of worship. It is a safe haven for wounded spirits, a firm foundation for unstable families, and a fortress in a community that is constantly under attack by outsiders trying to promote their own agendas by attempting to exploit the weaknesses of others. The Black church is one of the few institutions that endured through slavery. After worshiping with their masters, slaves would secretly attend their own church, an invisible institution located in the backwoods of plantations or in their slave quarters, where they would hear a liberation gospel that taught them that God created all men equal. The Black church continues to be the place where Blacks go to receive encouragement, affirmation, and validation. The Black church is the mother wound of Black culture. It has birthed schools, banks, hospitals, insurance companies, colleges, universities, housing developments, and a political ideology of justice. It has nurtured young talent for musical, dramatic, and artistic development. E. Franklin Frazier's description, Nation Within a Nation, represents the multiple levels of involvement that the Black church has in the Black community. Within the numerous metaphors used to describe the Black church, there lies the opportunity to discover how the positive environment of the Black church supports the learning of Black children. Our discussion is divided into 3 sections: the origins of the Black church, the historical development of the Black church, and the contemporary Black church, which is where I will contextualize my studies. In each of these areas, I will highlight the complex relationship between religion, language, literacy, relationships, and politics for many Blacks in general, and specifically for African Americans. The origins of the Black church: pre-slavery West Africa through the Great Awakening. The history of the Black church is not a history of consensus. E. Franklin Frazier asserts that all traces of African heritage were erased by the inhumane experiences of slavery. And for many years, many people agreed with that. There was a belief that African Americans were slaves, and that was it. There was no history. But Frazier's beliefs have been challenged by contemporary scholars who have demonstrated that the history and the heritage of African American people do not begin or end with slavery. It goes back into ancient Africa, back to the origins of all mankind and the rise of civilization. A question to consider is, where did the Black church come from? A closer look at the history of the Black church will help us bring clarity to this and other questions. But first, let's go all the way back to the beginning. How did Africans get to America? Contrary to the past teachings of many historians, most Africans were not sold by brutal, barbaric brothers as slaves to white Europeans in exchange for tobacco, alcohol, clothing, and other material gain. Most slaves were sold by chiefs and other powerful decision makers as prisoners of war. They did not sell their brothers, they sold prisoners of war. The first 20 Blacks were brought to the U.S. in 1619 as indentured servants, and they gained their freedom after several years of bondage, according to the history books. We now know that Africans were already here, living in unity with the indigenous people when the Europeans came to America. However, a slave market was created as Europeans brought more African slaves to the United States. Farmers and plantation owners were unable to cultivate their own large pieces of land, so they made requests for slave traders to bring large amounts of slaves over. After a period of time, some plantation owners made requests for slaves from specific geographical locations because they seemed to be a better fit for certain types of labor. Some of them were able to salvage their beliefs, values, languages, and religious practices. The African slaves taught their first-generation American-born children, thus perpetuating some of the African religious practices. Now, the West African sacred cosmos, as you see on the screen, was created by Sobel, who believes that the worldview of a people is their way of making sense out of the environment. He uses 5 categories that assist in the canalization process of what he calls the West African sacred cosmos: time, space, causality, purpose, and concepts of being. This construct can be used in the study of American slaves through analysis of the developing worldviews of Black Africans as they collided with the changing worldviews of white European Americans. Sobel's concept of worldview is especially significant in terms of finding the origin of the Black church. From their worldview, West Africans had to form new identities in the United States, and they spoke many different languages and had various religious practices, but the social trauma of slavery motivated them to search for commonalities and combine those commonalities to create a collective worldview, which captured the essence of their most significant values and beliefs. This creation of this collective worldview was possible because there were fundamental, foundational similarities between the West African belief and value systems. What were some of these religious, beliefs. Some of the foundational West African religious beliefs were similar, and they included God as supreme being. West Africans believed in a supreme God who was in total control, and they understood the importance of being in touch with him. They desired to commune with him and live in peace. To achieve that end, they were committed to living a certain way. Prayers and worship. Prayers to the supreme God were common. Prayers were offered daily and some at ritualistic occasions such as planting, harvesting, and before a battle. Extemporaneous prayers were spoken throughout the day. Man. The soul of man is seen as being separate from the body. It is a gift given, and its destiny is in the hands of the body that possesses it. The living dead and divinities were seen as middlemen who were mediators between God and humans. Because they were dangerous, if they were sold, they had to tell the new slave owner that they were a median because blacks and whites were afraid of them. Transcendentalism is defined as the ability to leave one's physical space and was used especially in times of severe beatings, watching lynchings of their own family members, and separation from family. Spirit possession. Africans believed that good and evil spirits could possess individuals, animals, and objects. Trained professionals were asked to mediate to find out the spirit's desires and purposes. And finally, the ring shout. The ring shout was a dance during which the participants moved in a circle, clapping their hands and patting their feet in a rhythm. One person set the tempo by singing, and the other answered in a call and response pattern. The dancers often danced until they achieved euphoria. Sounds familiar? The detailed explanation of common West African religious beliefs and practices illuminates many similarities to contemporary Christian beliefs. It is clear that West African beliefs did not become extinct despite attempts to destroy them. Instead, when attempts were made to proselytize West African slaves by introducing them to white Christianity, common West African religious beliefs collided with white Christianity, and it resulted in black liberation theology, a fresh, new perspective of the Christian Bible, a theology of justice and liberation. It was a perspective that focused on God's special love for the disenfranchised. With the birth of black liberation theology, an interesting phenomenon occurred. Some West African practices were adopted by white Christian churches who believed that blacks had a special relationship with God unlike their own. And those dances can be seen throughout the camp meetings that many of them were having during the Great Awakening. The shared accomplishments of West African slaves provide undeniable evidence of exceptional intellectual acuity and spiritual enlightenment. Now, we will discuss the historical development of the black church. During the Great Awakening, when large numbers of black slaves were introduced to white Christianity, the responses of black slaves varied. Some retained their beliefs and continued with their West African religious practices, and others on smaller plantations tended to move toward their slave masters. However, most slaves ended up somewhere in the middle. They accepted the Bible as the text, but interpreted it from the black theological perspective. The motives of white Christians also varied. Some wanted to share their religion because they truly believed that God wanted them to spread the gospel to all men based on biblical mandates. But others used this sharing of the gospel as justification for participating in the slave trade, disingenuously pretending to care for the souls of their slaves while lining their pockets with earnings from the barbaric institution of slavery. They attempted to share Christianity as a way of keeping the slaves in bondage by emphasizing scriptures that focused on obedience and being satisfied with one's current state. Additionally, whites did not agree on the issue of access to literacy for blacks. Some slave masters and whites in the North felt compelled to teach blacks to read to improve their quality of life. They believed regardless of one's station in life, they should have access to literacy. However, other whites strongly disapproved of allowing blacks access to literacy. They believed illiterate blacks were more docile and less dangerous than literate blacks. Despite the disagreements between whites concerning the sharing of white Christianity and access to literacy, many blacks were introduced to Christianity and began to learn to read. In fact, the Black liberation theological perspective was made possible because some blacks learned to read the Bible for themselves. Black slaves began to meet secretly for private worship services to share scriptures that emphasize freedom and justice for all. From these secret meetings, the Black church emerged. It emerged as a result of West African religious practices colliding with white Christianity, thus creating a social justice ideology, Black liberation theology. It emerged as a result of blacks learning how to read the Bible for themselves and sharing the liberation gospel with other blacks. It emerged as a result of West African slaves finding commonalities in their varied languages and developing a complex communication system that reflected Black liberation theological beliefs about biblical texts. This new language, or communication system, if you will, combines several West African literacy practices, including storytelling, music, rhythm, sound, and gestures, and included drumming, singing, and dancing. And yes, it included secret messages from songs like Go Down, Moses, and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Coming for to Carry Me Home. Yes, these songs had multiple meanings. The song could be an announcement that worship service was going to occur that night in the backwoods, or it could mean that a plan was established to run away in pursuit of freedom via the Underground Railroad. This communication system required a thorough understanding of biblical texts to retell the story metaphorically, while simultaneously using their musical skills to develop a melody. Then, of course, they had to sing the song in a way that did not reveal their true intent. This is the rich history of the Black church and an explanation of how it emerged. The common experience of slavery and the continuous inhumane acts supported by perverted political agendas did not destroy this group of people. Instead, many sacrificed their lives to improve the quality of life for others. This kind of sacrificial love is the motive for relationship building that continues to bind the Black church together in love, despite outside opposition. From the dawn of the Great Awakening to the turn of the 19th century, church expansion occurred throughout the country. Let us consider the historical development of the two largest Black Christian denominations, Baptists and Methodists. Highlights of Black church expansion. In 1758, African Baptists of Bluestone Church on the Williamburg Plantation was founded in Virginia. In 1772, Harry Hosier, also known as Black Harry, accompanied Francis Asbury, a Methodist evangelist sent by founder John Wesley to build Methodist societies in America. They traveled over 300,000 miles by horseback and organized the first Methodist meeting houses. In 1773, George Lau, a slave born in Virginia, became converted while accompanying his master to church and was freed by him to carry out the ministry. However, when his master died, the heirs questioned his free status. Lau evacuated with the British, but not before baptizing Andrew Bryan to carry out the work. From 1785 to 1787, blacks began to leave the white Methodist societies to form their own colored Methodist societies. The extent of the common practice of within-church segregation can be understood from close examination of St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. Blacks were not only restricted to sit in certain pews in the church, but church classes were segregated by race. Some blacks weren't satisfied with this kind of treatment. Richard Allen, a local Philadelphia Black Methodist preacher, suggested that blacks form their own church, but few blacks agreed with him. Instead, they formed the Free African Society and asked several white philanthropists in 1791 to purchase land for a church building. This timing was impeccable. The gallery had just been erected, and Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and other blacks were directed to sit there. Just as prayers began, the blacks were snatched from their knees and ordered to the rear of the gallery. Instead of retiring to their seats in the rear, Allen states, and I quote, "All went out of the church in a body, and they were no more plagued with us in that church," unquote. At the altar of reconciliation and liberation, they were snatched from their knees, told to go to the rear of the balcony or get out. They chose the latter. In 1794, Allen, who was committed to maintain the Methodist form of worship, organized Bethel Church of Philadelphia, which is the mother church for AME. In 1798, the first Sunday school in New York was founded by Catherine Ferguson, a black woman who was initially illiterate. She invited 45 poor black and white children from her neighborhood in New York every Sunday, fed them, taught them hymns, and taught them to memorize scriptures. In 1800, there were 15,000 black Methodists and 25,000 black Baptists. Now, in the North, the move toward more racially separate churches was a protest against discrimination in the white Baptist church setting. During this time, several African American churches were started in the North. In 1805, First Independent Baptist Church in Boston was founded by Thomas Paul. And you're familiar with the next church. In 1808, Abyssinian Baptist Church was founded by Thomas Paul and his brother Benjamin Paul, later pastored by Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor. In 1826, the first black Sunday school was formed in First African Baptist Church in Savannah. In 1830, the AME Church was organized nationally, and they focused on the education of their people. In 1834 through 1841, associations were organized in the North in Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and Canada. And 3 associations were birthed from the Consolidated American Baptist Missionary Convention from 1880 through 1894. In 1894, an annual meeting of these conventions proposed a merger of the 3 bodies. And this is important because I am a member of this organization. The merger was accomplished September 28, 1895, in Atlanta, Georgia, at a meeting attended by more than 500 delegates in the city where we are today. The new organization was the National Baptist Convention, USA, Incorporated, with subsidiaries, foreign mission, home mission, and education boards, to which a publishing concern was added in 1897. Reverend E.C. Morris was the first president of the new convention. This display of unity was timely because blacks entered a new era of intensified discrimination. On the eve of the 19th century, in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And in 1898, Louisiana originated the Grandfather Clause. This intensified discrimination was met with a determined resolve from the black church to fight for freedom, which amplified black church growth across the country. Before the Civil War, the AME Church had approximately 20,000 members, but by 1886, the number increased to 75,000. Between 1890 and 1906, the number of black pastors also increased from 5,500 to 17,000. Within the Black Church national organizations, while they were growing, they not only focused on political issues, but it's important for you to note that they focused on educational issues as well. Many black institutions of higher learning were founded by black church organizations and continue to be supported by them today. Among them, our Virginia Union University, Shaw University, Morehouse College, Spelman College right here in Atlanta, Wilberforce University, Morris Brown, Allen, Paul Quinn, Shorter Junior College, and Edwin Waters. From the Great Awakening to the dusk of the 19th century, the black church expanded exponentially. Despite attempts to destroy them, they bound together in love. Relationships were strengthened and deepened by this commitment to sacrifice oneself for others. These relationships helped the black church weather the storms of Jim Crow and launch the civil rights movement in the 20th century. The dawn of the 20th century proved to be a continuation of anti-black efforts. From 1890 to 1910, laws were passed by all Southern states which effectively disenfranchised blacks and gave license to lynchings and other forms of racial suppression. These court rulings are representative of the political climate during this time and indicative of the legislative and judicial support for overt racism in the United States.
Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. White oppression wreaked havoc in the lives of many blacks through multiple anti-black political, social, and educational agendas, and the Black church responded with an unwavering fight for freedom. In 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois and others, including some whites, met and advocated for a civil rights organization, and you're familiar with it. The NAACP was birthed. The Black church served as a resource for human capital for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They focused on social justice and politics. They focused on encouraging their congregants to become members and actively participate in marches, boycotts, sit-ins, and other efforts. The NAACP was not the only group that was focused on political issues. But at that time, religious organizations were allowed to sort of make headway in other areas. The National Baptist Convention created the new board, the Sunday School Publishing Board, in 1915. And while these things were going on, a transformation was occurring in the membership of the Black church. Migration from the South to the North and from rural to urban areas required the Black church to adjust some of their ideas. Blacks migrated to the North in search of jobs that could finance a better life. Membership roles expanded. This is a picture of Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., who opened one of the first soup kitchens for hungry migrants at Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York. The migration period ended in the late 1950s during the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. One of the best examples of the Black church's level of Black consciousness can be seen in their involvement in the Civil Rights Movement. This movement was led by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist preacher, and began with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. From the beginning, the Civil Rights Movement was anchored in the Black church. It was organized by Black ministers and laity and financially supported by Black church members. With the Black church as advocate, Blacks made many strides during the Civil Rights period. Thank you, thank you. That song just still makes you want to put elbows together and rock. We shall overcome someday. It is during this time that a bouncing baby girl came into the world destined to examine the literacy practices in the Black church. At the height of the Civil Rights Movement and on the cusp of the pro-Black period, I was born the 8th child of M.T. and Pecola Thompson, a young couple who left their Alabama roots and moved to Michigan during the Great Migration. As the oldest son, my father picked cotton and chopped cotton as a child to help take care of the family, which required him to be absent from school most of the time. He left Muscle Shoals, Alabama, with a 3rd grade education and traveled the country as a professional gospel singer. He met my mother, Pecola, in Saginaw, where he lived with an older cousin, John Henry, who told him there were jobs, automotive jobs, available. Mama moved to Oak Ridge, Tennessee from her home in Montgomery, Alabama, to work as a domestic worker at the historic Manhattan Project. After a traumatic experience, she bought a bus ticket to Saginaw to visit her uncle on her way to California to live. But she met my father. They fell in love, got married, and the Thompson family grew. My home was filled with books, and my family took turns reading to me. My parents were adamant about providing opportunities for us to learn and grow. With limited resources, they found a way to buy us encyclopedias and other books and take us on vacations every year. They were excellent literacy role models, and in fact, Daddy went back to school and graduated from high school the same year that my brother MT became the first college graduate on both sides of the family. In our family, the graduation cap is a family artifact that symbolizes the sacrifices made by our parents to leave us a legacy of literacy. My mother reached the 9th grade before she left home to pursue her job in Tennessee, and she returned to school and graduated the year before I graduated from high school. Mama and Daddy set a legacy of literacy, and combined, my siblings and I have 12 college degrees. Mama was my first and most important teacher. She taught me at home, but she was also my Sunday school teacher. I remember sitting in her class as a young child as she read from the big red Bible storybook with such inflection and animation. She made the story come alive. I could visualize Daniel in the lion's den and Jonah in the belly of the whale because she made the words on the pages live. I loved attending Sunday school and couldn't wait to get there every Sunday. Every week, my mother would ask her students about school because she wanted to know about every aspect of their lives. But it made me really sad to hear that my Sunday school church family friends did not like school. I felt so badly about it because I loved school and loved my teacher at school. I was fortunate to attend an exceptional elementary school with teachers who cared about us. Some of them lived in our neighborhood and attended the same black churches that their students attended. My school was chosen to participate in the national pilot for President Kennedy's Head Start initiative. And yes, my parents signed me up, and I was in that pilot program for the first Head Start. Mrs. Eva White was my teacher. Her read-alouds reminded me of Mama's Sunday school lessons. She made the stories come alive, and I couldn't wait to get to school every day. This is a picture of my first grade report card. Mrs. White was also my first grade teacher. In fact, she followed the same students for 2nd and 3rd grade as well. She didn't have children of her own, but she became our surrogate mother. While attending predominantly black schools with caring teachers, a prophetic voice spoke to my soul. So the mindset carried me through grade school. You see my afro on that picture. And with my I'm black and I'm proud mindset and my most likely to succeed trophy in hand, I stepped onto the campus of University of Michigan, a predominantly white institution, to face the hardest time of my life up to that point. But lessons learned in my home, in my church, and in my school prepared me for that phase of life. I graduated with an economics degree from the University of Michigan and landed a position as a broker, a financial consultant at Merrill Lynch. That's right, I invested other people's money for a living. It was a time of growth and maturity, and during this time, I met the man of my dreams. We got married and began a family. And I became less interested in investing money for other people and more interested in investing time with my son. I wanted to stay home, and I was able to do that during their formative years. Vince and I went back to school to pursue degrees at that time and fulfill our God-given purpose. I enrolled in a master's program in the educational leadership at my local university, and my teaching experiences while subbing caused me to revisit those childhood wonderings. Remember in my mother's classroom, in her Sunday school class, I couldn't figure out why some of my friends were not enjoying school. I saw the same phenomenon when I started subbing. They were disillusioned, disinterested, and considered at risk. How could these same students who were superstars in their churches not like school and be considered at risk there? Some of my professors said, hey, you have a good question. You need to go back to school and answer your own question. During that time, my family continued to grow. These are my sons. My husband and my 2 sons graduated the same year with a high school diploma, a college undergrad degree, and a doctor of ministry. And on the other side is Dr. David at his graduation this year from University of Chicago. So, yes. So I went to Michigan State, met Pat Edwards, and got involved in the Michigan State Spencer RTG program. And while there, I went back to a research agenda that allowed me to have an intersection of revisiting those childhood wanderings and the family legacy of Black Baptist pastors. This is my grandfather, who is a pastor, my daddy, who is a pastor, and my dear, who's also a pastor. And all of that began to intersect for me. So during that time, I began to focus on why are some African American children successful in the African American church, but considered at risk in their classrooms at school. My first pilot study was a preschool student in his Sunday school and his predominantly white preschool. In this study, my goal was to carefully examine literacy practices in the church and school settings for Joshua, a Black male preschooler. I wanted to identify possible sources of incongruence between his Sunday school and school environments. I chose preschool because I wanted to look at the initial signs of incongruence. The findings illuminated a troubling concern. Joshua was considered exceptionally bright in his Sunday school class, but socially illiterate in his predominantly white private preschool. In Sunday school, he could retell all of the Bible stories, and his teacher often let him assist his fellow students with class activities. But in his preschool, when he tried to help a fellow student who was struggling on the computer, the teacher accused him of cheating. Unfortunately, these mixed messages received in the different environments frustrated this 4-year-old child to the point that he came home and told his mother, I hate school. I'm going to drop out. From this rich descriptive study, I was able to develop a conceptual framework, discourse patterns, pedagogical issues, and social norms. The questions under discourse patterns focused on how does communication occur in class? Who gets included and who gets excluded in conversations? Pedagogical issues focused on how does teaching and learning take place? And social norms examined who makes the rules and how are they enforced? The next study was BJ and Marcus. After conducting the Joshua study, I wanted to be able to freely converse with several students about their church and school experiences. BJ was a middle schooler at the time, and Marcus was in high school. Both were very capable of articulating their learning experiences. The BJ and Marcus study illuminated the importance of building relationships with students. Both BJ and Marcus emphasized their desire to meet the expectations of certain teachers who cared about them, and their lack of motivation to achieve in the classes of teachers whom they felt did not have their best interest at heart. Travis and Tony's study allowed me to extend the conceptual framework to include what I learned in the Joshua and BJ and Marcus studies. Literacy network systems were added. It comes from a combination of Signethia Fordham's fictive kinship system and Ken Frank's social network research to consider who are the literacy influencers that support or do not support student learning. These influencers include more than classroom teachers, and it's a mistake for classroom teachers to think that they are the major literacy influencers. Using intentional sampling to choose my subjects, I asked the first grade teacher to provide a list of her most at-risk students. Although Travis and Tony were the top readers in their first grade class, decoding at a 5th grade level, they were also considered the most at-risk students in first grade. By the end of first grade, Travis had been suspended 12 times, and Tony had been suspended 8 times. These are first grade, 6-year-old boys. At this point, I'm sure you're beginning to see the same pattern that I saw in my studies. On the one hand, these black boys are academically astute, but their behaviors and the social norms enacted in their classrooms clashed. The disciplinary approach was to implement exclusionary tactics, such as timeout, to get Tony and Travis to conform. But the unintentional outcome was that they were also excluded from academic opportunities, including a chance to attend the magnet school for the gifted program because the teacher refused to sign the papers. Their experiences at church were quite different. Although Travis had a disagreement with his children's church teacher during one of my observations, he eventually calmed down because she pulled him in rather than pushed him out, and redirected the negative behavior by assuring him that he could choose the appropriate behavior if he wanted to. She expected Travis to make the right choice, and he did. She immediately gave him a big hug and asked him to help pass out the material for the next part of the lesson. The next study in children's church identified some of the sources of incongruence between the church and school learning environments for African Americans. I closely examined 2 particular black churches, but this time, I not only looked for differences, but I looked for points of connection. And there were a series of connections that were in those particular churches, some of them including concepts of print, storytelling, and some other things. I wanted to specifically identify these similarities because we coined, Dr. Patricia Edwards and I coined this concept of shared domains of literacy. We realized that people were wondering, what can happen, like how can you glean from the black church? And if you glean it, how can you enact that in the classroom? And we were able to come up with some of those practices. The Saginaw Oakland Literacy Project was a 6-year longitudinal study that began with 2 elementary schools and a K-8 school. And we used grounded theory and a community-based participatory research perspective to build this project. Teachers learned how to read the reports because oftentimes they don't know how to read the standardized tests. They identified the greatest areas of challenge and learned how to plan and implement data-driven instruction. But something happened. There were state mandates that came down, and they became very frustrated. We find that oftentimes negative influences can impact the position and the direction of a project. They were filling out paperwork to meet the priority school requirements. They became extremely frustrated, and I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this kind of thing. At this point, we decided that we needed to take this project outside of the school and into the community. After 2 years, a community center and 2 neighborhood churches, including my church, St. Paul, where my husband pastors, began to be the place where we had these projects. So the teachers had professional development in the community center while they were teaching students without all of the stress that occurred during the school year. It was a win-win situation for both the community and the teachers. They developed a better understanding of the community and developed long-term relationships with the community brokers, and those community brokers visited the school, and a close relationship occurred. In the next study, Raising a Standard of Excellence in Our Community, we continued to work. The neighborhood had experienced the same type of transformation that has happened across the country when decisions were made to destroy black and/or poor neighborhoods, to build highways, leaving poisonous toxins in the atmosphere. Grocery stores closed, clothing stores moved to the malls in the suburbs, and some people were left with limited access to necessities. But we used a 3-generational approach to teaching and learning. We had a garden because it was a food desert, and the older gentlemen helped the younger people learn how to garden. We also had people come in and talk about their profession. We had some entrepreneurs, some of them are here today, and they talked about music, they talked about art. They learned all about sharecropping, and one of the things that we challenged them on was during the Great Migration, our forefathers moved from the south to the north to work in the foundries. But we focused on a new migration from the foundry to the college campus. and then to the community through entrepreneurship. The last study is a study that is occurring right now. And in fact, it is called the Wolverine State Missionary Baptist Convention I Read, I Lead, I Succeed reading program, where we have approximately 25 churches and a school district. We began in 2019 as a face-to-face program, but we had to switch in 2020 because you know what happened during COVID. Right now, we have approximately 30 churches, including Saginaw, Flint, and we're working on the Pontiac project as well. In this particular project, we have one-on-one tutoring online, and we focus on reading fluency and oral retelling. So here's what I want you to know. Overall, what I've learned from these studies conducted in the learning environment of the African American church is that there is a Black church pedagogy. Black church pedagogy includes Black liberation theology, literacies, the communication system, and it includes politicized ideologies. It is all encircled with sacrificial love and relationships. That is the only way that we can reach and teach our children. The Black liberation theology you're familiar with, we've already talked about it. And the politicized realities, I do want to just put a pin there for a second, because attempts to limit access to literacy through policies is still happening through things like the third grade reading law, scripted reading programs, and biased assessments. The literacies that are included in Black church pedagogy, we look at authentic opportunities to practice oral language skills, such as the times when students are doing extemporaneous prayers and speeches, and welcoming the visitors during church, reading the Bible and songs and church bulletins. And comprehension is always used within the Sunday school classes, such as retelling in the Joshua article. Critical thinking skills, because they have to be able to apply those ideas. The communication system is still the same: singing, rhythm, gestures, and storytelling. And of course, it is all circled with relationships and sacrificial love. We focus on that in a book, Affirming Black Students' Lives and Literacies. And my co-authors, Dr. Patrianne Smith and Dr. Arlette Willis. In this book, we talk about the love that I'm describing. That is my story. Now I challenge you on, what is your story? Who are you? Where do you stand? Recently, the APA came out with a good example for us to take notice of. They apologized for long-standing contributions to systemic racism. If you were not aware of this, make sure you check it out. They talked about their role in promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism, racial discrimination, and human hierarchy in the United States. They talked about how they have ignored oral histories from people of color. I ask you again, where do you stand? Why do you do what you do? And if you're not doing anything, when will you begin? This is my story, a rich legacy of love. I am fulfilling my calling handed down from God above. What is your story? Where do you stand? Are you doing your own thing or working toward a master plan? I invite you to take up this cup. You are never too young or too old to take up this cup. Check your motives. Conduct an audit of your soul. Take up this cup, though bitter it may be. Through sacrifices of love, future generations can be free and have access to literacy. To take up this cup, you must reject your know-it-all spirit, biases, and selfish greed. Your motive must be love for people. You must desire to truly meet their needs. What are you thinking? Can you look inside and see? Take a look in the mirror and face reality. Together, we can write our story of liberty. I invite you, and especially fellow researchers of literacy. Sure, you can continue to do your own thing, and I can continue to do mine, but what a terrible price we'll pay if we leave any of God's children behind. I implore you to take up this cup, drink the sorrows within. Let's hold each other accountable, working together we can all win. Yes, winning for our children, making sure all can read and write. By any means necessary, join me in this fight. A fight for literacy. Literacy brings light. The fight for literacy, for it is a human right. There's an urgency in my plea for all of you to join today. Make your commitment. Take up this cup. Let's join forces, for we are LRA. Take up this cup, fellows. Praise God. Aw. Aw. Thank you. Yep. Aw. Are you taking a picture? Okay, where? It's too big. Somebody hold it. Thank you.